I want to talk about the heresy of Christian pacifism. We all know that there is no one who's an actual pacifist, because that would be tantamount to justifying suicide. And they know this. Pacifism is usually an overreaction to something that usually a leftist doesn't like. So they don't like the Vietnam War because they didn't like communists being attacked. Therefore, they became pacifists. Yeah, they throw rocks at cops, but that's not what they meant. There is no pacifism. However, people like Leo Tolstoy and many others promoted this idea of non-resistance to evil. And they manipulate and mangle New Testament passages completely out of their Old Testament context, or even their New Testament context, and to try to justify their point of view. It is absurd. It's a heresy, and it's simply completely illogical. And you have people at this point, I just always overestimate the ability of my opponents to make logical arguments. I'm just stymied by how awful their point of view is. Now, part of it is because Westerners live in fear that the slightest ideological deviation from multiculturalism will lead to the termination of their job, their employment, and possibly the loss of their children. And this kind of drives the ideological bias of the normie. Being a normie is very expensive. But an obnoxious variation of this absurdity is the notion of Christian pacifism. To claim this, and you see this even in Orthodox circles, they have no concept how an Orthodox empire can exist without warfare. And they don't really go that far. But to deny the ability of Christians to resist evil by violence denies the Christian state, denies self-defense, denies the defense of the church. And this is, believe it or not, based on the Hallmark card version of the word love. Christians must love their enemies, we're told. And they usually look at you with this very knowing smile, like they made a great point, They imply, of course, that love means unconditional indulgence. But if you are trying to be a scholar in this area, and you're not independent, as I am, fear and conformity will drive your intellectual pursuits. Biblical studies has been butchered beyond recognition, like all fields have. But it's driven by a lot of unfortunate assumptions. A lot of bad arguments, in fact, almost all bad arguments, rest on very faulty assumptions. These are axioms. They're indispensable, of course. But an axiom is an unargued assumption that serves as a limit to what your study is going to deal with. Ground rules. The most obvious, of course, is non-contradiction. That's an obvious one. But an axiom, they're the borders that frame the question. They're taken for granted. Now, I've come up with a handful of proper axioms to try to counter this when it comes to understanding the New and the Old Testament. Number one, words today don't mean what they meant 2,500 years ago, regardless of the translation. Family, law, soul, sword, all these things were defined then in a way that would be totally unrecognizable today. Plain words of the Bible are rarely so. Number two, the individual, this isolated monad, did not exist in the ancient world or in any normal world. It's a purely industrialized, modern, postmodern idea. It should not be referenced at all, except in severe cases in any kind of biblical or even ancient medieval studies. Number three, Americans live in a violently revolutionary age. Knowledge and logic themselves are under attack. So reading this epistemological chaos back onto history is one of the worst errors in interpretation. What we live in is a deviation, not the norm. Number four, political correctness might be a necessity for academic promotion, but it's never the foundation for biblical interpretation. That a view might be professionally convenient has no relation to its truth, and in fact usually contradicts it. Number five, most authorities of the Old Testament in the universities are usually alienated urban liberals who are absolutely repulsed by the content of what they study. They're not to be trusted. They're usually wrong. They're occasionally useful, and I've gotten some good out of them, but their careers and their peer estimation are far more important than actually getting somewhere. They don't really believe in what they're writing. Number 6, the books of the Bible are not the only authorities in Christendom. And that's simply because they don't interpret themselves. I can't believe I have to explain that to people. But they're not self-interpreting, therefore they can't be the ultimate authority. The men who put the Bible together are of greater authority than the Bible itself. That is to say, the church, speaking through these many individuals, men. Number 7, the terms Bible and Scriptures reference different things. The Bible refers to the 74 books that the church over several centuries permitted to serve as the foundation for its life. Scripture is broader. It refers to all the ancient writings on the faith. Now, that line is vague, of course. The distinction is very real. Number 8, and this is extremely important. The New Testament does not make any sense without the Old. The Old Testament is the context for the New. That's why it's there. Without understanding the Old Testament, the New is nonsensical at worst, trite at best. Regardless of how long and difficult the Old Testament is, it is still critical to Christianity. These aren't decorative books. They're not talked about because they're politically inconvenient, because they're long, and because they're not immediately understandable. They're not good for the one-liners. And truly, number 9, the New and the Old Testaments aren't really separate. With a handful of clarifications that Christ made explicitly, they have the exact same message. And I make the distinction between Old and New, but that's a fairly modern concept. To divide the two testaments is improper. Christ does appear in the Old Testament, for example, as the Savior of the children in the furnace. In Daniel, he appears quite often, not in human form, but he certainly appears in the Acts. The fact that he's second person of the Trinity means that he appears in the Acts. Therefore, to make this distinction between the Old and the New Testaments is simply improper. Number 10, refer to the Old Testament. That doesn't refer to something that's been surpassed or out of date when you use the word old. The concept of old in that sense, that comes from American consumer culture, not history. 11, when Christ spoke in the New Testament, he assumed that his hearers were well versed in the law, or at least knew its conceptual foundations. They led that every day. They heard that every day. That's where they lived. He assumes that as he's speaking. Therefore, if you don't know that foundation, he really is talking nonsense. If you know the foundation, it becomes very powerful and profound, but few people do. Number 12, very little of what you've been told about the ancient world is true. Scholars go into this with a purely mythical understanding of what the ancient world, medieval world was, and therefore their interpretation is by definition going to be skewed. The assumptions that these were terrible, backward ages does not inform proper interpretation. And finally, number 13, the overwhelming majority of people, regardless of their educational level, are incapable of interpreting anything, let alone something as complex and profound as the Bible. We are all deeply sinful. Can you imagine being a secular normie, liberal in university, and trying to interpret Christ's words? Imagine how absurd that is. It's almost like an SNL skit, if it was funny. Some of us have been given specific gifts, intellectual or charitable, whatever it is, and we can function in those in very, very humble and very limited ways. But otherwise, to think that someone born and raised in this sick postmodern culture can interpret his own life is ridiculous. Now, I just have these 13. It could be a lot more than that, but they're just a few. And unless you understand them, your research is going to be skewed from the very beginning. But the assumptions that I'm referencing here, they're a constant source of error. Constantly reading back modern distortions and priorities and liberal terminology into the ancient world is not just an error, it's almost a breakdown of cognition. And these people are making money in the universities. And these idiots preaching on television. Probably the greatest error in Western history is Protestantism, in the sense that the individual, in this very vague sense, can read and understand, of all things, the Bible for himself. That's one of the greatest errors that informed all the other errors of our sick age. Now, with that being said, and that is our background, we have to come to understand the nature of Christianity in relation to force, violence, and things like hate and contempt. Christianity has always, from its inception, been a religion of violence, or at least a religion of force and coercion, but certainly never wanton violence. Now, assuming that the word violence is easy to define, which it is not, it's not a problem in and of itself. It has to be used for the right reason, has to have the correct target, and more importantly, has to have the right mindset behind it. You have to be doing it for the right reason in the actor's mind, not just in the ideological sense. It could never come from anger. It could never come from the passion. It's like when you're disciplining your children. If you're doing something out of anger, it's wrong. You need to do it solely for one reason, and that is the desire to improve the lives of those who you're dealing with, which is the definition of love. You're going to sacrifice yourself for the sake of improving the lives of others. If those conditions are not met, then violence, force, coercion is sinful. This exists on a personal as well as a societal level. Leo Tolstoy, as I've said, is one of the great popularizers of this nonsense. Clearly, you see why the left is interested in this, because it takes the teeth out of their big enemy, really their only enemy, the church. And he popularized the heresy that violence and Christ were mutually exclusive, which, by the way, of course, condemns the existence of every Christian empire, every Christian state, every Christian society, and every Christian army of the last 2 millennia. And for Tolstoy, including the one where he lived and made his work possible, he was anathematized partially for that reason. It's always struck me that physical violence is somehow worse than other forms of coercion, emotional abuse. It's not. But because of modern legal systems, it's taken on that coloring. You could torture somebody emotionally, financially, and legally for decades, and that's perfectly okay. But when he finally loses it and slaps you, you go to jail. That's the absurdity of the modern legal regime. It's not rational. It's not meant to be rational. But physical violence is easy to quantify. Emotional violence is not. Because really, to a great extent, it's just, to some extent, it's subjective. Physical violence, though, is objective. You can see it happen. You can see the results. Now, when I use the word violence, and this is a paper, too, I'm going to be publishing very soon, I'm referring to only physical coercion. The regime, especially the feminists, have tried to make violence to be whatever they don't like. The point of that is to get around any constitutional limitations on state power. If you claim that certain speech is violence, then it's not protected by the First Amendment. It doesn't really matter anyway, because power is held in private sources, and private sources are not constrained, allegedly, by the Constitution. So it's really, and the founders couldn't possibly have understood that at the time, so the whole thing is really irrelevant. They can destroy you and destroy your life without government being involved at all. So, Jesus Christ never, under any circumstances, preached a doctrine of non-resistance. Non-resistance to what? The first act of Christ's ministry in the Gospel of John, chapter 2, was the very famous act of making a whip and flogging essentially the usurers from the temple. Now, you didn't need to talk a lot about violence in the New Testament, since the Old Testament is so violent. That's already taken care of. Christ never, ever condemned it. But that sort of, that physical coercion was normal in the ancient world. It was using physical violence far more than in the modern world. Modern world relies on legal and emotional violence and humiliation. That sort of thing is far more effective and far more damaging. But it just shows you the militant mentality that you have to have. Judicious violence is justified for the right reason. In Matthew 21, in Mark 11, Christ spoke of cleansing the temple of heretics. And in that case, right before his death on the cross, meaning that the two events were related. So in Matthew, for example, right afterwards, the blind and the lame came to see him at the temple, and he healed them. And this is when they Hosanna to the Son of David, and of course the proto-Talmudists, the Pharisees, were extremely angry here, and the Bible records this. Once the temple was cleansed by violence, the miracles of healing began. And to think the elite at the time were unaware of that connection is to be deluded. And it comes from the Old Testament, it comes from Jeremiah 7, where he says, "Will you steal and murder, commit adultery, perjury, burn incense to Baal, and follow other gods you have not known? And then come and stand before me in this house, which bears my name, and say, we are safe to do all these detestable things. Has this house, which bears my name, become a den of robbers to you? I have been watching, declares the Lord." And of course, when Christ is whipping these guys, he cites Jeremiah 7 directly. Christ is always very tightly connected to the prophets. And the cleansing of the temple was based on this passage. One of the horrible evils in theology today is that the prophets are almost entirely unknown. I predicted this before, I'll predict it again. The Old Testament will be removed from the Bible. Certainly the present Pope of Rome will do that, or whatever title you want to give him. And you'll see in the Fanar and a few other places, liberal Protestants have been ignoring it for a long time. One of the good things that the Christian identity movement has done is, taking the Old Testament very seriously. And in fact, it's from them, I can't remember who specifically, where I got the idea that really the Old and New Testament should not be separated. It is one message stretched out over time. So when you talk about Christ allegedly preaching this doctrine of non-resistance, resistance to what? It's evil. Non-resistance is identical to tolerance. They'll scream and yell at that fact, but it is. To not resist it is to allow it to occur and to do its work. That means it's the doctrine of the moral equivalence of good and evil. Now, Christ was arrested and murdered by the Judaics. Evil was given a very brief and false victory, but only so that Satan will be humiliated later. Now, this was specifically predetermined. That was a specific circumstance. But because of this humiliation and death that Christ had to endure, death itself was overcome. Now, again, don't assume that death means when you stop breathing. That is a purely modern understanding. Death was a far broader concept in the ancient and medieval worlds. Not breathing really wasn't that interesting because that was just considered a part of life. It wasn't as fetishized as it is today, where people don't even see, in the Middle Ages, death was not covered up. It wasn't this, hidden away in funeral homes like mine. I was born and raised in a funeral home where you kind of make up the dead and make them look like they used to. Never works, but we have this very bizarre. I remember one day I was driving my father's hearse home from the, I think it was a cemetery in Essex County, New Jersey. And these kids in a Mustang, this is like 1990, pulled up next to me and started laughing and pointing. This happens. They weren't hostile, but it was weird. They saw a hearse, and I'm driving it. I was driving very quickly. I drive very fast. I had the Buick hearse up until 85 one time in the Garden State Parkway. But I rolled down the window, and I said, "Guys, you're not going to be laughing when I have your mother back here." And as I'm uttering those words, I've said it more than once, I thought, oh my God, these are tough-looking kids. But they weren't laughing anymore. They said, Happy New Year, and they left. This was, early January. I think it was 1991. I never forgot that. It was a yellow Mustang, very fashionable at the time, when gas was 80 cents a gallon. I still remember them. I can still picture them. And I've said that since then. How is this hearse funny to you and interesting to you? When your mom's back here, you're not going to be laughing. And I thought they were going to do something, and they didn't. In fact, they sped off on Raritan Road in Clark, New Jersey, where I'm from. The point I'm trying to make here is that ancients and medievals had a connection with death that moderns don't have. Had a connection with, things weren't sexualized like they are now. Those drives were not covered over, and so they weren't mystified. But the death of Christ, and again, that actually meant the cessation of breathing. That's not the only way that death is used for the most part. Excommunication, sin is death. It's far more important than not breathing anymore. It's more important than that because you'd rather die than live outside of God's grace. So it's far worse. Death is not the worst thing that can happen to somebody. But Jesus took flesh for the express purpose of overcoming death in the very broad sense of the term. Point is, it's very common that Christ going to his death, not saying anything in front of Pilate who had nothing to do with any of this. He didn't want to have anything to do with it. He had other things to do. And Christ was very pro-Roman, as we all know. One of the reasons the Jews hated him so much. The Judaics, I should say. And, of course, rebuked Peter for pulling his sword. Somehow that's all trotted out to mean that we can't resist evil. The assumption here is that they believe that the death of Christ, that whole context is universalized. Because Christ was taken and humiliated. Therefore, we all have to be, and we can't resist it. And that's a very, actually an absurd assumption. It was a very specific case. And these idiots don't even ask, what was Peter doing with his sword in the first place? The point was for Christ to not resist because he had to die. That was the point. That's why he rebuked Peter. He had no problem with hurting people. The problem was that in this particular case, resistance was not a good thing. They didn't have the men anyway. They didn't have the power. Christ had the supernatural power. They didn't have the physical power. And the point was that he was to be captured and humiliated. But to think that Christ forbade Peter, and therefore that was a universal command, is ridiculous. He did it so his mission would be accomplished. There's a journal that I've been reading for a long time. It's called Faith and Heritage. I believe it's some kind of a the denomination. I think it's some kind of a Protestant. Is a basic theological assumption, but I've gotten a lot out of it. And I'm going to quote from, but they use pseudonyms, I think. I'm going to quote from it here on this topic. He's talking about our resistance and the Christ's lack of resistance for when he was executed. All men are to renounce their previous spiritual allegiances to other gods, instead of that, bending the knee to the risen and exalted Christ, whom the Father has tasked with universal judgment. This is the Great Commission, and it's as brutal as it portends. The eschaton, especially in Revelation, we see the fullness of these retributive threats carried forth with boundless severity and bloodshed. Jesus is charged with the right to judge all men, casting his enemies into the lake of fire and treading the winepress by the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. Revelation presents us with this picture of victory, and with this victory, the suffering and death of God and Christ's enemies. This is the central reason Christ underwent his humiliation. The punitive privileges of his office of universal lordship were central to the joy set before him as he meekly endured cruel persecution and death. The commission of violence upon his enemies was one end, for which his docility and gentleness were the means. It's unlikely that really a better understanding of this situation has ever been written. I couldn't recommend this website more. I'm not saying that I don't accept the Protestant part, but it is absolutely brilliant and original when it comes to its, original for us anyway, to its analysis of what things like violence and hate mean. What he means here, to summarize this, that things like Christ submitting to death was not a universal command, but it was a specific act dictated by circumstances of the moment. A moment that was, the most important for the church as a whole. That Christ's victory over death would have violent consequences, which are also blessed by God. And you know what I'm going to say next here? Matthew 5. So I might as well say it. Ye have heard it was said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. But I say unto you, resist not him that is evil, but whosoever smites thee in the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Very little thought goes into the endless repetition of this passage. It's postmodern lethargy and abulia read back onto the ancient world. This doctrine, since if you were to take it to its limit, conflicts with everything else in the New and the Old Testament. So it must mean something that is, what the moderns would believe it means. Such a doctrine was never given to a nation or an empire or a society. Where was it given? And with the context in Matthew 5, it was given to his followers right after the Sermon on the Mount. It's not a recipe to allow the world to be enslaved by evil. This was stated to his early followers under specific circumstances. Such a thing does not apply universally, and certainly doesn't apply to evildoers. That command in Matthew 5 has nothing to do with evil and our war against it. What it has to do with is his early followers getting essentially marching orders. If we are preoccupied, we're doing mission work, we're preoccupied with lawsuits and vengeance, and we see the Orthodox Church, the Catholics, they do it all the time. They hate each other over a tiny little, a bishop says something, or there's a minor area of doctrine. I hate this. That's exactly what's condemned in Matthew 5. This kind of, jurisdictionalism. If that happens, no mission work will get done. Christ is speaking to his followers here. He's referencing the workings of the church, not the church relations to the world. And in fact, modern translations have made this seem even more extreme than it reads. The point of those words, given that context, was to promote mission work by rejecting factions, infighting, and vengeance for personal glory. I don't have to tell you that this is a huge problem in the Orthodox Church, especially the true Orthodox Church, which has really lost a lot of its force because of the jurisdictionalism. That is exactly what's condemned in Matthew 5. When Christ said, resist not him who is evil, this is not a moral command, it is a practical instruction. We face ridicule, contempt, and hatred. We are provoked every single day. We can allow that to be turned into personal vendettas. If that were the case, it would never, ever stop. We would turn into people constantly fighting, personal glory. We see these jurisdictions, both in the traditional Catholics and in Orthodox, created on the most minor of pretexts. You need to ask yourself then what's the real reason that they're doing this, creating these groups upon groups upon groups. Only bishops matter. This is specifically condemned in Matthew 5. The Protestant writer Bertrand Comparet, he wrote an excellent article called "There's No Pacifism in the Bible." And he continues in this argument. He says, in Matthew 14 and Mark 6, when Jesus Christ was about to feed the multitude with a few loaves and fishes, we read that, quote, he commanded the multitude to sit down in the grass, end quote. That's a command. It certainly doesn't mean that it's a Christian duty to go around making people sit down in the grass. It was spoken only to meet the special circumstances of a particular time and place. But you shouldn't make a doctrine out of it. He says, so also with Jesus Christ's instructions to the early Christians to stick with the job for which he had chosen them, and not waste time quarreling with the wicked, and certainly not each other. That's the point of this. That's the context of this. And I'll say again, those claiming that these are universal commands assume, and I don't think they realize that they're assuming, they're implying the universality of these things. Any doctrine you could think of can find support in the New or the Old Testament somewhere. You can find a sentence here and there. The role of the church is to negate those personal interpretations. So these people will cite a passage like the one I just mentioned, but they don't realize that they're saying that they know what's universal and what's particular, what's a local command, practical advice, and what's doctrine. They claim to know that. They don't realize they're saying that, but they claim to know that. They pretend to know what's the universal command and what's just simply practical advice. Now, we know it's contradicted, though. If you want to take it the way these people take it, then we have Luke 22, verse 36. Not cited as much. Jesus said, "But now let the one who has a money bag or a purse," there's a million different translations, "who has money, take it, and likewise a knapsack. And let the one who has no sword sell his clothes to buy one." That's Luke 22. His apostles were to be armed. His apostles were to use violence against those who would hinder the work of the church. Hinder the work of the church through force. And of course, he's referring more than to a sword. A sword is a symbol. He's not actually literally talking about a sword blade. That also means, and we see this in St. Paul's letters too, the sword refers to the creation of states and societies, using lawful violence to defend the church. That connection is made all over the place, in fact. He who has no sword, sell his clothes and buy one. Sword doesn't just mean a blade you keep in a sheath somewhere. It is the command to defend yourself, to create Christian societies and states, and to be armed, and to use violence if necessary. So, to use, again, this is an extreme example. Let's say there's a subhuman trying to rape your wife, your daughter. No one is going to claim that the faith orders you to spout platitudes about the desirability of good conduct, that he must reform himself in the midst of this crime. If you don't intervene with extreme force, including the possibility of your own death, you are equally guilty of the crime. And this goes for personal behavior as well as any ethnic groups or states or empire. Again, Bertrand Comparet says, "It's only when we have been guilty of evil conduct and disloyalty toward God that he has allowed wicked nations to oppress us until we repented of our evil ways. Then he has himself used us as his own servants, an agent to make war against those wicked nations." Now again, I'm not endorsing any kind of Protestantism here. That's the last thing I would do. But his article was very powerful on this topic. And I want to quote him some more. "He," meaning God, "began our training in this early. He began our training in this early. When our ancestors came out of Egypt in the Exodus, they were attacked by Amalek. For this, God said he would have war with Amalek from generation to generation, until he had blotted them, the remembrance of them, from under heaven. And this duty he commanded his people Israel to perform," and we read in Exodus 17, and Deuteronomy 25, 17, 19. But that's just the beginning. In Jeremiah 51:20, God himself said to our ancestors and to us, "Thou art my battle axe and weapon of war. And with thee I will break in pieces the nation, and with thee I will destroy kingdoms." To accept the absurdity of Christian pacifism is to deny the entirety of the Old Testament. But the only reason anyone denies the Old Testament is because it's politically inconvenient, not to mention long and difficult and hard to understand. Because it can't be reduced to a slogan or two, it's ignored. Violence in the Old Testament is often connected with the Israelite state, which of course was an ethnic theocracy. But the very existence of a Christian state, or any society at all, violence is implied. Because states exist, at a minimum, in that they have the right to use violence under certain conditions. Now, if you deny the right of the Christian state to exist, then what of the Christian society? Can that exist? Because if you can't have states, you can't have societies either. Because societies have to be ruled by something. There has to be a method of rule and punishment. There's no getting out of that. You can't have societies, you can't have families either. So these platitudes about Christians can't have governments in one form or another, they then deny the right of Christians to have families or societies. If that's the case, of course, evil automatically triumphs. Therefore, the denial of violence means the triumph of evil. The 7th chapter of Judges, one of my favorite Old Testament figures, the judge Gideon, with 300 men to deliver Israel from the Midianites. Gideon, through deceit, by the way, in the way that he has a handful of men, ended up killing or severely wounding 120,000 of his enemies. We are clearly told that this was by the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Christ did not reject this. He didn't deny this. In fact, he cited these people and prophets and judges in almost every sentence he uttered. Because people don't know the Old Testament, they don't see that he's citing these people all the time. He's using the exact same words and phrases. He's making a clear connection with the Old Testament. If you don't know the Old Testament, then you don't know what he's talking about. Another one, and very overused, as we all know, the different translations, but essentially said, those who live by the sword will perish by the sword. This is one of the more ridiculous ones, because the assumption is that they're referring to the same person. No. In fact, that statement, those who live by the sword will die by the sword, is a justification of violence. There are two people here. There's two swords. Those who take the sword are using it illegitimately. They will be killed by those who wield it properly. The passage speaks of two swords. The aggressor, who will perish by the sword of the defender. And it's rare that even took me a while to wrap my head around that. It's such a common slogan that has caused a lot of confusion in all groups, not just Orthodox people. Those who live by it will die by it. That doesn't mean that somehow living by it, whatever that might mean, but it certainly means the illegitimate use of it will die by the fact that it's illegitimate. No, it means that the righteous will destroy them. That's what that means. There's two groups of people that he's referring to there. In Revelation 19, it said of Jesus that in righteousness he doth judge and make war. Christ over and over and over again, as the prophets before him, recognized the obvious truth. There could be never any peaceful coexistence between good and evil. You don't need the Bible to tell you that. The notion of rational persuasion always made me laugh. The reason that they're evil is that they don't understand rational persuasion. That's the whole concept. Evil people, whatever you want to call it, sick people, whatever you want to, these destructive forces, they don't hear rational persuasion. If they did, they wouldn't be evil. Therefore, if good men refuse to fight, evil will rule them. And if these people really are serious, now I've come across many of them recently, those who advocate pacifism will, in my opinion, when evil is victorious, however temporarily, will rationalize this victory and try to find their place in it. My personal opinion, especially today, those advocating pacifism are justifying their own lack of activity. They don't want to be uncomfortable. They don't want to fight. They don't want to sacrifice anything. So they accept this ridiculous doctrine of pacifism because it justifies them not having to do anything. War and violence exist because evil exists. Evil is justification for war and violence. Another aspect of evil is that it's aggressive, like a cancer cell. When Christ comes, where will he find you? Hiding in abject terror? Even these idiots who act like, I'll be praying for victory. Well, victory by whom? The only way they can answer rationally is that they're seeking God personally to destroy their enemy. But nowhere in the scripture, or the tradition, or in history, or anywhere else has that ever occurred. God works through his people. In other words, the person who says, I'm praying for victory, I don't have to do anything, he's praying that someone else risk his life. But they're not going to say that, so Christian nonviolence is, it sounds more acceptable. In 1 Peter 4:13, our sufferings are reflective of Christ's sufferings, and of course, as Christ himself says, that of the prophets. Violence and political power, which are, they overlap tremendously. That depends on our frame of mind. I'm quoting from the same website already. Again, insofar as Christians are not politically and socially ascendant, insofar as we are in a state of humiliation ourselves, we are to emphasize our submissiveness to authority, our respect for the extant social order, our unwillingness to chafe under sufferings and pursue retaliation. That's the mark of true strength amidst suffering, knowing as we do that suffering and death cannot thwart God's purposes. This does not entail that we should not seek power, however, for power is power to do good. Nor does this entail that once we attain this ascendancy, we are never to exercise our power against the enemies of Christ. Rather, just as we understand Christ attained exaltation to be exercised for good, with due evil befalling his enemy, so also we can understand our own vocations. Meekness certainly has a place for a king, including the King of Kings, but it has its place alongside the righteous exercise of dominion, violence, and coercion. Again, that website, the way that these guys have put this stuff out is absolutely brilliant. When resistance does no good, when violence will lead to nothing but recrimination and death and destruction, you shouldn't do it. In the Soviet Union, once the Civil War was over, there was no point in taking up arms. That would just mean not only would you be killed immediately, nothing would get done, but it would then justify even more reprisals against people. But when resistance and violence does do good, it should be used judiciously according to the law. But again, you don't need the Bible for that. That's basic common sense. Violence, the state, coercion, hatred, contempt, these are all part of natural law, aspects of God's creation that deals with basic fundamentals. Now, physical pain, causing physical pain, is a neutral act, just like state action is. The Old Testament is our guide to what a Christian government is supposed to be. That's why the Old Testament exists. Violence can be used for virtue as well as vice. And talk about things like hatred, which come up over and over again. It is a part of natural law because it is a reaction to evil. One of the Psalms that everyone forgets about because it's very inconvenient. The psalmist is Psalm 109. It's a prayer to God. The psalmist says this. He's talking about his own personal enemies. Appoint someone able to oppose my enemy. Let an accuser stand at his right hand. When he's tried, let him be found guilty. May his prayers condemn him. May his days be few. May another man take his place of leadership. May his children be fatherless and his wife a widow. May his children be beggars. May they be driven from their ruined homes. May a creditor seize everything he has. May strangers plunder the fruits of his labor. May no one extend kindness to him or take pity on his fatherless children. May his descendants be cut off, their names blotted out for the next generation. May the iniquity of his fathers be remembered before the Lord. May the sin of his mother never be blotted out. Then he says, help me, O Lord God. Save me according to your unfailing love. Let them know that it is at your hand, that you, O Lord, have done all this. The psalmist, David, is praying for the destruction and humiliation of an enemy, a personal enemy that he despises and hates. There is no getting around this language. It is a personal hatred. There's no getting out of this. But, there is a moral end to be gained here. The Psalms are filled with prayers like this. That suffering and destruction should be brought on the like 104, 125. There's a bunch of them. Now note, that last section that I quoted, the psalmist connects the terrible fate of his enemies to God's love. Because it's an act of God's love that these people suffer this way. Again, the writer I've been quoting says here, we are to love our own enemies, but we're to hate God's enemies. That might be a common answer presented. That was likewise an answer which I promoted in my previous article on biblical hate. Its force is clearest from the two passages cited at the beginning here, Matthew 5 and Psalm 139. But the latter passage says, I count them as mine enemies. David, the inspired psalmist, here writes that his shared hatred of God's enemies makes them to be shared enemies as well. God's enemies become his personal enemy. It inevitably follows that it's permissible, even righteous in certain circumstances, to hate certain individuals as personal enemies to one's own person. This principle has been much more obvious in other psalms, which explicitly refer to personal enemies of the psalmist. 6, verse 10, Psalm 35, verses 4 to 10, and 109, 29 FF. I've made the argument that hatred can't be done to personal enemies. I was incorrect. What I should have said is that it can't be done for personal glory. There is really not a big distinction between our hatred for our personal enemies and enemies of the church. If they're an enemy of the church, they become my personal enemy. That line just doesn't really exist. If we're part of the church and people are trying to destroy it, how can it be anything other than a personal hatred? Of course it is. It's personal, and that hate is an engine by which we are motivated to take action. Hate comes from a revulsion against evildoers. Now, if it has another reason, then it's a moral problem. But the purpose of hate is legitimate. It is an engine to destroy the enemies of truth of the church. If it has any other motivation, now we have a problem. But hatred guides us towards the truth. So a better distinction here is hate or violence, for example, based not on personal glory. It's for the betterment of others under very specific circumstances. Because God's enemies deserve hatred, not in and of themselves, but because the nature of the sins that they commit. Let me quote St. John Chrysostom here. This is from Homily 9 on the evangelist Matthew. Only the person who becomes irate without reason sins. Whoever becomes irate for a just reason is not guilty. Because if ire were lacking, the science of God would not progress, judgments would not be sound, and crimes would not be repressed. Further, the person who does not become angry when he has cause to be, he sins. An unreasonable patience is a hotbed of many vices. It fosters negligence, stimulates not only the wicked, but above all the good to do wrong. Which is what I said a few minutes ago. The people who claim that we're supposed to love our enemies, which means do whatever they want, we're supposed to pray for them and do nothing else, we can't resist them. It's very convenient. It means I don't have to do anything. I don't have to become uncomfortable. I don't have to get involved. I don't have to confront anybody. Very, very convenient. Someone else maybe will do that. St. John Chrysostom very clearly says, hatred and anger, which is what he referred to being irate, is justified. If and only if there is a good reason for it. Sin and evil naturally produce revulsion and contempt. But then he also makes it clear that if you're not repulsed by evil, you are a sinner for that reason. This bizarre interpretation of the word love, this patience, alleged humility, in this case, is not really about humility. It's about not wanting to do anything. And that's what John says when he says it fosters negligence. And then the wicked, he says, stimulates the wicked, meaning that it gives them incentive to continue their work. When they don't see resistance, they will redouble their efforts. But St. John Chrysostom here, in Homily 9, in the Gospel of Matthew, is in contrast to what every preacher will intone from his pulpit. Every professor of theology will tell you this. Every modernist priest will tell you this, in a very pompous tone. Anger, hatred, violence are legitimate and praiseworthy if it's done for the right reason, at the right time, and for the right end. This is not contradictory to love. In fact, it is sometimes required by love. If through our contempt they receive a benefit, then there's no distinction between love and hate. That's a modern English language distinction. Hatred, contempt, exclusion, even violence, under certain circumstances, can bring about somebody's reform. If that's your motive, then you do what you have to do in that sense. But if anything else is your motive, you have a problem. And that's very difficult. It has to be a properly virtuous, well-channeled contempt. No army goes into battle without this motivation. They're fighting for something. They're angry that they have an enemy. They think about their wives and children, whatever it might be. It's anger. It's hatred, both positive and negative. It's love for their own people, but it's also love for their enemies. They're sinners. They're doing the wrong thing. Since everything else has failed, violence is all we have left. If these people lose the war, they may not do this ever again. They may become very different. They may recognize that these people, the good people, will fight and will not allow them to do whatever they please, will not be humiliated. That's what's happening here. It's a disposition of love. It's about self-sacrifice for the sake of benefiting someone else. Then to act hatefully towards somebody. If this is a retribution for sin, for the sake of his own reformation, then that's what you have to do. To love someone would be, possibly, to exclude them, under certain circumstances, severe, to hurt them, if absolutely necessary, as I mentioned in the example above. This is a part of loving disposition towards your enemies. It can be, if absolutely necessary, to shut them down in one form or another. Hatred is a passion, but it's praiseworthy if and only if it is properly channeled and understood towards an end, a moral end. You discipline somebody, you do it not from hatred. You do it not for your own glory, now you're drunk with power. You do it because you have a responsibility. You discipline your child, you never do it out of anger. Or at the very least, that anger exists because you love him so much. You want to make sure that he does the right thing, and you have to make sure that he will never do it again. That has to be your motive, not because it's not just some retribution for its own sake, that somehow your personal space has been violated. Those are two very, very, very different motives. There's nothing wrong with any of these emotions. But it has to be a part of a well-ordered society, a virtuous disposition of the soul. And we've spoken about that at great length, about how the soul is to be ordered from Plato onward. But St. Augustine says too, this is his sermon on 1 John, chapter 4. St. Augustine says, "If any of you should wish to act out of love, brothers, don't imagine it to be a self-abasing, passive, and timid thing. Don't think that love can be preserved by a sort of gentleness, or rather tame listlessness. That's not how it's preserved. Do not imagine that you love your servant when you refrain from beating him, or that you love your son when you do not discipline him, or that you love your neighbor when you don't rebuke him. That is not love, it is weakness. Love should be fervent to correct. Take delight in good behavior, but amend what is bad. Love the man, but not the error in him. God made the man, but the man alone made the error. Love what God made, not what the man made. If you love one thing, you remove another. When you esteem one thing, you change another. If you are severe, let it be out of love, for the sake of correction. This is why love is represented by a dove, descending on the Lord. Why did the Holy Spirit, who pours his love into us, take the form of a dove? The dove has no bitterness, yet she fights with beak and wings for her young. Hers is a fierceness without bitterness. In the same way, when a father chastises his son, he does so for discipline. As I said earlier, a kidnapper will inveigles the child with bitter endearments. He'll treat the child very well. He's a kidnapper, he wants the child to go with him in order to sell him. A father, for the sake of correction, chastises without bitterness. What Augustine is saying here, of course, what I've been saying from the beginning. He uses the example of a kidnapper. Elsewhere in this sermon, he says, you should note that when a kidnapper wants to steal a child, this is very relevant to today, he treats the child very well at first. gives him candy in the van, that kind of thing. Treats him very well. That's just to get him complacent. That is not love. In the same way, when a father who loves his child spanks him or excludes him or does something even harsher under certain circumstances, gets older, that also is an act of love. Love has all kinds of expression. That includes contempt and exclusion and violence, if absolutely necessary. Psalm, I mentioned before, Psalm 109 is proof of this. How love is expressed differs according to circumstance, but the end can only be the betterment of our enemy, or at an absolute minimum, as we see in the Old Testament, their destruction for the sake of the preservation of the truth. Loving enemies does not exclude hate or violence. Enemies should be loved, but never supported. Psalm 109, so as we pray for our enemies, but that they be either punished or converted. I mentioned that the book on the Middle Ages I have coming out, and I quote Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologica, and he says, on vengeance, vengeance consists in the infliction of a penal evil on one who has sinned. Accordingly, in the matter of vengeance, we must consider the mind of the avenger, for if his intention is directed chiefly to the evil of the person on whom he takes vengeance and rests there, then his vengeance is altogether unlawful, because to take pleasure in another's evil belongs to hatred, which is contrary to charity, whereby we are bound to love all men. That's exactly what we're talking about here. He treats love and charity as almost synonymous. I have an essay in Aquinas and Aristotle on charity, or love and charity in this new book. But it does justify violence if that's the only option you have left. To let it go and not correct is, of course, to indulge and to be a part of his evil. It has to be done with charity, because its only purpose is to stop the spread of sin. If it doesn't have that purpose, then it is wrong. The postmodern world sees the word love in the most bizarre, typical, postmodern idea. It's a saccharine feeling. It's a kind of eros suitable only for greeting cards. No deeper than that. Love is about the selfless act of benefiting someone else. That includes everything, however unpleasant, that might benefit someone. The drug addict has to go through withdrawal. Forcing an addict to suffer like that is an act of love, even if he means that he hates you forever. It's harsh and painful, but it's done for his own good. Love is not synonymous with pleasure. Love is not synonymous with indulgence. Christians should not let Hallmark cards define their theological world. And let's put an end to this nonsensical concept of Christian pacifism. Thank you, everyone, for listening. I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.